Growing up, the place that we learn the most about our society's history is in school. And for nearly a century, when it came to the Civil War, the Confederacy, the capital S South, American schools either left out some damned important pieces of the puzzle, or they simply lied. On YouTube, the phrase "they lied to you" is often the last thing you hear before you board a one-way train to downtown Crazyville. And it seems like everybody's accusing everybody else of lying or making up facts these days. As a rule, it's probably a good idea to be wary of internet people peddling truth. So instead of just telling you what happened, I'm going to show you. And we're going to start there with the lies. Millie Rutherford was born in 1851 to a wealthy family in Georgia. She was born into a mix of academic tradition and Confederate loyalty that was probably unique for a woman of her time. One of her uncles was Howell Cobb, a 5-term congressional representative for Georgia who later served as the state's governor. He also became an avowed secessionist, and he served as the president of the Confederate Provisional Congress, the group that wrote the Confederate Constitution. Afterward, he took a commission as a Confederate general, and his daughter, Mildred's cousin, would go on to design the Confederate Cross of Honor in 1899, state's Medal of Honor. Another uncle was Thomas Reed Roots Cobb. He attended Georgia's secessionist convention, he helped found the University of Georgia Law School, and he founded the Lucy Cobb Institute, a finishing school for young girls. During his legal career, he wrote the quintessential legal treatise on slaves in 1858, in which he describes the Negro as mentally lacking the ability for self-improvement, yet well-suited for direction by a superior, as having a physical talent for hard labor, and a character to be happy as a clam in circumstances that would crush the spirit of a white person. He also became a Confederate general, and his estate lists the names of 25 slaves among his property at the time of his death at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. The Cobbs were one of the most powerful and wealthy families in Georgia at the time. Cobb County in Georgia is still named after them. So, not a lot of head scratching when it comes to how Mildred Rutherford eventually became a weird mishmash of Mary Poppins, Dolores Umbridge, and Frau Forbissino. Rutherford herself attended the Lucy Cobb Institute from its very first session. She went there for 8 years, she became a teacher in Athens, Georgia, and then later returned to the institute as its principal. She basically ran the place for the next 4 decades. Rutherford was consumed with this idea that accepted history was slandering the Confederacy. Rutherford decided that if she didn't do something, future generations would forever believe outlandish Yankee lies like the Confederacy started the Civil War, that the Confederacy fought to defend slavery, that the Civil War was fought because of slavery, that slavery was, bad. Even worse, this slander was being taught to Southern children, and everyone else in the nation as well. But one finishing school for girls is small potatoes in terms of winning hearts and minds for her beloved South. Enter the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Rutherford was involved with them for quite some time by this point, but she became their national historian general in 1911. She then transformed that position from basically an internal records keeper, or scrapbooker, into something else. Rutherford eventually wrote a measuring rod for textbooks and brought it to the National Confederate Veterans Reunion being held in her home state of Georgia in 1919. At the time, Rutherford wasn't the only person dicking around with the academic narrative of the Civil War. The lost cause myth had been evolving for 50 years by this point. Infiltrating school curriculum wasn't new, but this pamphlet standardized the effort. It was sent out to chapters of the United Daughters, Sons, and Veterans of the Confederacy all over the country. If their efforts to influence local and state school boards were unsuccessful, they would sponsor essay writing contests, which invariably rewarded the essays that most conformed to lost cause ideology. This letter is from 2 years after Rutherford's Georgia speech. It's from the Rutherford Committee. The letter is a scathing, line-by-line rebuke, which goes on for umpteen pages about things considered unfair to the South. The link to see the full text of this letter is down below, but it basically is a list of half-truths, omissions, and how dare yous. It's pretty much a textbook example of how to win an argument without using facts. Many textbook makers received letters just like this one. Most of the time, they just made the changes suggested by the assorted United Confederate groups. The resulting textbooks would then be used all over the country into the 1970s. As a result, generations of American school children learned the history that the losers of the Civil War wanted them to learn. Rutherford's measuring rod is a direct distillation of lost cause themes. I'm going to dive into a few specific things from her book because, big picture, This is a debate where one side claims that the other is out to destroy their proud heritage and erase it from history. The people today who are making those kinds of accusations and are just saying we're just trying to protect our history belong to the exact same groups that have been saying the exact same things for more than 100 years. They present themselves as stalwart defenders of historical truth who must constantly resist the onslaught of Yankee, Northern, liberal historians who only want to defame a proud and benevolent culture. Because reasons, I guess. So when they claim to be defending a proud culture and heritage, it's important to understand what they mean. What truths do they consider important to defend? I'll let them tell you. The big ones are that the Confederates were not a bunch of disloyal, treasonous anti-Americans. The whole thing was the North's fault, and the Confederacy wasn't even big on slavery. Also, slavery wasn't even that bad. Gonna have to go back and put a huge asterisk by my head on that one, just so nobody quotes me later on that and tries to blackmail me for all my no money. It's important to note that people can believe whatever kooky things they want to believe. That's their right. I can't get in their head, and I don't really want to. But as far as society is concerned, there's a functional difference between, hey, these are my beliefs, I can believe whatever I want, and telling the rest of the world that this is the real picture of reality and imposing those beliefs on everyone else. So how accurate is this stuff? Well, let's start with these guys. These are the Confederate generals that signed on to the Rutherford Committee in 1919. As it turns out, nasty bits of their own history aren't the only thing that these guys remember with rose-colored glasses. As time marched on and the number of Confederate veterans dwindled, many chapter records indicate the steady retroactive promotion of members who were still alive, to the point where pretty much everyone still alive became Colonel this and General that, even though, some of them were 17 when the war was being fought. This promotion creep is one explanation for the fact that of the guys listed here on the Rutherford Committee, it goes Colonel, Captain, Major, but doesn't really show up in the records at all. Private and Private. The other explanation is that these men held the rank of general within the United Confederate Veterans Organization. Each of these guys was the regional leader of an area that had many different veterans chapters in it. They were a general within the Veterans Organization. Whether or not that was supposed to accurately reflect their status in the Confederate Army, holding the rank of general in the Confederate Veterans Association counts for as much, in society as holding the rank of general does in the Salvation Army, which outside of those organizations is precisely dick. Either way, there are now pictures of these men in the roles of Confederate veterans dressed in generals' uniforms and listed as generals. That illustrates how much these guys cared about historical accuracy, but also how hard it can be to undo historical inaccuracies. Because accident or not, many online resources now list some of these men as Confederate generals, and none of them were. Turning back to Millie's pamphlet, Rutherford goes through her measuring rod point by point, with quotations, argument, and evidence to support the truth of her assertions. Rutherford claims that the war between the states was not fought to hold slaves. She then goes on to talk about how Congress and Lincoln didn't want to fight to free the slaves. It's kind of the same point, but not really. She doesn't say a word about why the Confederates fought, which you'd think would be the relevant part to the whole not fought to hold slaves thing, seeing as how the South were the folks who started the fighting and who had the slaves. But whatever. Rutherford also gives us two arguments so devastating that they would be, quote, unanswerable. The first is that Grant, in charge of all Union armies, owned slaves, and that Lee, in charge of all Confederate armies, did not. How General Lee becomes the patron saint of the South is kind of an interesting story that I'm not going to get into here, but this claim is a balls-out lie. Here's a legal document from 1859, freeing Grant's one confirmed slave that he ever owned, who was either purchased from or given to him by his father-in-law. Grant wrote several letters talking about how he considered the practice of slavery to be, quote, dead before 1863. Grant's father was very anti-slavery. He was an abolitionist. Grant's father-in-law, however, owned several slaves, some of whom were probably put in the charge of Grant's wife. Grant wrote to his wife suggesting that her father transfer ownership of these slaves to his wife. But in context, it's clear in that letter that he is concerned that these slaves will be sold off to pay her father's mounting debts, and Grant didn't want to see them split up. He also said he'd never live in a slave state again, although it's hard to tell if he's talking about just because he wouldn't be welcome, or if they would win the war so there wouldn't be any, or if that was a choice he was making. So no, Grant did not own slaves when he was in charge of all U.S. Army forces, or during the Civil War at all. Lee, on the other hand, owned 3 or 4 families of slaves who he inherited from his mother. This is according to his son, Robert E. Lee Jr. Lee also got control of nearly 200 slaves when his father-in-law died and left Lee to execute the will. The will explicitly stated that these slaves were to be freed within 5 years and the estate was to be sold off. But instead of freeing these slaves immediately, as the slaves expected, Lee decided that he had 5 years to work them hard to make the accompanying property profitable. He also rented them out to various other people, splitting up family groups as he went along. And the slaves kinda began to hate him. There's also a group of slaves who escaped from the property but were then recaptured and returned. According to the account given by one of the slaves themselves, Lee ordered up to 50 lashes each. When Lee's overseer wouldn't do it, Lee called in the local constable, who had no problem dishing out the punishment. According to this account, Lee then ordered the slaves to be doused in brine, literally pouring salt into the wounds. Historically, this first-hand account has been largely discounted over the years, probably because, of who was giving the account. Which I just have to point out the surface-level hypocrisy here. Ignoring somebody's eyewitness account just because of their race is a super weird thing to do when you're trying to argue that you're not racist. But you can't dismiss court documents quite so easily. Lee asked a court to delay the 5-year stipulation in the will, but the court ruled against him and his inherited slaves were legally freed. All about 2 days before the Emancipation Proclamation freed the rest of his slaves too, at least in name, if not in fact. Rutherford says that 200,000 slaveholders were in the Confederate Army, but 300,000 were in the Union Army, which is, yeah, a little awkward, or at least it would be if it were at all true. This one took some digging to figure out. For one thing, Rutherford is saying that roughly 500,000 slaveholders fought in the Civil War total. She doesn't give a source or a date, so it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how to tackle this, but crunching the numbers from the 1960 census, there were only a little over 400,000 military-aged men from slaveholding families in all of the slave states combined. Sure, during the Civil War, men could come of age, and the Confederacy expanded its definition of military age to get more recruits, but it would take a 25% increase in available manpower to give us Rutherford's total. And then, according to Rutherford, 60% of those slave owners would then run off to join the US Army instead of the Confederacy. This gets even more ridiculous given the fact that not all slave states joined the Confederacy. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware did not. Kudos to you guys. West Virginia gets an honorary mention as well for bailing to make its own state in 1863. Mostly because the poor folks up in the hollers didn't really have slaves, and they were like, well, if everyone's seceding, why can't we? For Rutherford's statement to be true, a huge number of slave-owning men from the Confederacy would have had to leave the South to fight for the US Army, which, if it were true, would shoot giant holes in this idea of the loyal Southern soldier simply fighting out of duty, honor, and to defend his home. One way or another, you're lying your balls off. I think I did track down where Rutherford's 300,000 number comes from, though. Apparently, about 200,000 federal troops came from slave-legal states that didn't join the Confederacy, while another 100,000-ish came from Confederate states. What Rutherford has done is to take the 300,000 US Army troops that joined up from slave-legal states and call them 300,000 slave owners. In truth, maybe 1 or 2% actually were. I have no idea where she gets the 200,000 figure of Confederate slaveholding troops. In another work, she expands this claim, though. She says that only 200,000 of the 600,000 troops in the Confederate Army total owned slaves. She doesn't give us a source for this, of course, but it's worth noting that even while she's trying to downplay how important slavery was to Confederate soldiers, she's still saying that fully a third of all of them owned slaves. This is what happens when you don't spend time with people who have different views than you. You're like, a third's low, right? It should be fine. Incidentally, 33% is only a tiny bit higher than the overall average of what percentage of households in the CSA owned slaves. So maybe Millie just worked forward from that. This page ends with a quote that's attributed to General Grant, saying that he would fight for the Confederacy if he learned the purpose of the war was to abolish slavery. The source listed here is the Democratic Speaker's Handbook, a speaker's guide for and from the super racist Democratic Party of the time. There is no evidence that Grant ever said this outside that source, nor is there any reason to think that he thought this way from his correspondence or biography. Rutherford's citation here is about as authoritative as a neo-Nazi citing Mein Kampf as a historical authority. I think that's probably enough examples, but this parade of bullshit goes on for another 14 pages. Unfortunately, this pamphlet provided just the tool that the various memorial groups were looking for in their ongoing effort to control how future generations would talk about their beloved Confederacy. As a result, we got books like Virginia, History, Government, Geography, which was one of 3 books approved for use in grades 4 to 12 in the Virginia school system. Within these 3 books, we can find gems like slaves didn't work as hard as free paid laborers because they didn't have to worry about losing their job. Slaves were better off in Virginia than in Africa and were really happy to be there. That Negroes weren't ready to self-govern. That General Lee was handsome, and that his horse walked upright, as if it knew it carried a great man. That one's my favorite. The high school text even referred to the period between 1861 and 1865 as defense against invasion. It didn't mention the Civil War at all. These textbooks probably reached more than 1 million kids in Virginia alone. How these came to be is an insane story in its own right, but the thing that's absolutely peanut butter on pickles levels of crazy is that these were published in 1956, and they were used all the way through the 1970s. Mildred Rutherford's singular legacy is in aiding the creation and adoption of a fictional history. And for that, she has a dorm building named after her at the University of Georgia. If you'd like to let the University of Georgia know how shitty it is to name anything at an academic institution after Mildred Rutherford, the contact info you'll need to voice your concern is listed in the description below. I do want to thank these fine people for joining up and helping me keep that dream alive. And thank you for watching. I'll see y'all next time.